Hi, everyone. I'm Anu. I'm the Vice President for the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Club. And it's really nice to see that you've joined us today. I hope the last 2 days have been really productive and insightful. Today, we have Ravi with us. He's a co-founder and partner at Dalberg Design. He brings human-centered design and systems thinking to clients looking for creative approaches to breakthrough innovation and expanded collaboration in social impact. And he was previously an executive strategy director at Frog Design, focused on emerging markets in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Now, over to you, Ravi.
Thank you for the introduction, and nice to be here. Really excited to join this conversation with all of you around this very important topic. I know that that this is not an ideal model in which we're all virtual and don't have the opportunities to come together and really collaborate and come up with ideas together. But this is the new normal that I know all of you have been adapting to. We've had to adapt to as well, and it's just really exciting from where I sit to see you all organize something like this. We do a lot of work around COVID and more generally around infectious diseases. I mean, with previously around the Ebola crisis and Zika crisis. And what's interesting about the current situation is much as we think that we have ideas that may work, that this particular type of pandemic, as I'm sure you're all aware, is so different in many ways and is throwing up new types of challenges. And there's just not a lot of good examples of what's working or what truly will be successful. So looking for creativity from more places, looking for ideas from more places is what we all need to do. And so really excited that you all have committed to want to try to tackle this problem in your own way. So what I'm hoping to do with the time that I have is I know that you're all thinking about this problem from so many different perspectives, which is great. Some of what may emerge may be specific products, some may be services, some may be broader programs, some may be focused on government actors, on corporations, on social enterprises, on communities, or combinations of all of those. And I understand that you're all thinking about problems across the world as well. And so I'm going to try to paint a picture for you on how to potentially approach this, recognizing that I'm speaking to many different audiences that have many different interests. But I'll do my best to share some insights for you. I think there's two parts of what I wanted to share. First is some inspiration. Just some of the work that we've been doing, which primarily focuses on lower income and lower resource countries, but also, given the nature of the pandemic, has started to spread more broadly. So I want to share some examples of the work that we do and point out some design principles, right, that I think could be interesting. Right. Obviously, you all are working in a very compressed timeline, but hopefully there are some insights that emerge from some of the work that we've done that could be relevant to how you're thinking about things. And along the way, I want to call out some specific methods that you could be useful as you go through this creative process of coming up with ideas. And then I'll conclude with a deeper dive into some of these methods, specifically in the context of how you use these methods in more of a remote working environment, which is what we're all doing right now. So with that, let me share my screen. And do you all see, I assume you all see the cover slide in front of you? Okay, great. Just a quick word of a couple slides of introduction first. So just to tell you where I'm coming from, the fundamental belief that we have is that our creative potential in the world is being wasted. That is the most precious human resource from our perspective. It's the capacity for creative problem solving and the human right that we all have to co-create solutions that address the needs of communities. And this is really the ethos that guides the work that we do at Dalberg Design. As I mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Dalberg Design. We partner with organizations around the world to bring communities to the table so we can design solutions to address the challenges that affect their everyday lives. Fundamentally, we use a design process, but design in the broadest sense of the word, brings in a lot of elements of research, of creative facilitation, of analysis, of strategy. But ultimately, we're a mission-driven firm focused on positive social change and improving social impact. We are part of a larger firm called Dalberg, which has been around for about 20 years. It's a global impact advisory firm, has offices in 22 countries, most of them in the global south. But the design team, we are essentially, we have 4 studios, London, New York, Mumbai, and Nairobi. And work in a very integrated way with the rest of Dalberg. We find that as designers, we bring in a perspective that starts with understanding needs and behaviors, the actual people we're trying to help. So it is a very human-centric or human-first approach. But we often, to really have impact, of course, we need to think about governments and policy. We need to think about partnerships. We need to think about funding. We need to think about strategy and business models. We need to think about measurement and evaluation. We need to think about data, and all of these come together, and that's the reason we are building a design practice that's integrated in this way with a broader set of capabilities. So a few examples of just inspiration that around, drawing on some of the work that we've done in COVID, with COVID. So in the early days, we did some work in the US, in New York, and also in London, really trying to think through what is the impact of COVID for people who are commuting. This is, I think, before obviously public transportation started shutting down in many places. And one of the most helpful frameworks that I'll share more on later is a journey map, right? This is a core tool that we use in design all the time, which really is about thinking through the steps of the journey, the steps a person goes through, and really trying to identify how they feel, what are the needs, what are the pain points, what are the challenges, what are the motivations that are driving them, what are the behaviors that are happening. When you break down a problem in that way, it allows you to think through each of the steps and potentially devise solutions. I think the key here is that a solution should think broadly about what the full experience is. And this is where I think COVID times actually change what we think by the full experience. It could be when you think about a daily commute, you may think about the commute from the moment you step into the train station. But actually in COVID times, you're finding that planning is such a concern for people that the experience actually starts sooner, right? And so you may even be thinking about planning your next day, you're planning your day or your commute the day before, right? And that actually means that the journey, the first step of the journey starts earlier. Similarly, the journey may actually be affected by things that are observed as opposed to actual actions that take place. So one of the things that we found was that yes, you could think about signage, you could think about mobile apps, you could think about services that are provided by the transportation providers to help. But at the same time, simple things like a notice around when the station was last cleaned, right? That is typically not something that people will notice, but if it's repeated over time, regularly, it starts creating a sense of security, right? And creating a sense, even if it's not noticed, right? So think about those types of explicit and implicit cues across every step of the extended journey as you think about your solutions. Another example is some work we're doing in Kenya, a program called the Safe Hands Initiative, which is, in Kenya, there's, like in many developing countries, social distancing is likely not going to work, just given the density of populations in certain areas. And so we need to think about other solutions. And in some cases, just some of the core solutions around better hygiene, hand washing, et cetera, can make quite a big difference. And so a key challenge there is if you have the supply of PPE and hand washing, how do you actually get it out there as quickly as possible to as many people as possible, right? And we find this in many countries where we're working in Africa, where you may have a supply of products, but you don't necessarily have an ability to get them out as quickly as possible. And so a key solution here could be around activating a more comprehensive distribution system. So the tool we use here is an ecosystem map. How do you think about normal product distribution, right? There's a whole network of logistics that essentially get supplies from warehouses to retail environments to people's homes or people's stores and then to their homes. But what is the more extended network, right? You can tap into the unused capacity of trucks moving in certain directions. You could tap into the capacity of people who are traveling, who are essentially visiting their families and bringing, bringing supplies to their local communities. You can tap into the capacity of farmers, right, who are transporting seeds to aggregators or produce to aggregators. There's a lot of excess capacity across the distribution ecosystem that if you've mapped out properly, you could bring into a system, into a broader solution, right? So a tool like an ecosystem map helps you visualize complexity of what right now seems like very different distribution networks and bring them together into one system where a solution could be designed. Another example of some work that we've done is around, this is simple communications around, around what COVID is and how you, how you should take care of yourself, but it's localized, right? And this is something that we find, and particularly in times of pandemics, where there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety in communities. And ensuring your message gets across is important. Now, this seems pretty obvious, but think about a country like India, where you have hundreds, and depending on how you count it, thousands of dialects, right, that are being spoken. And even coming with a message or delivering a message that's delivered in the national language, such as Hindi or English, may be understood, but is it truly resonating with communities? And being able to localize in language, in not just in language, but also in the particular words, phrases, metaphors that are used, can actually make the message feel more authentic and more meaningful. And so, how can you do that in the context of, even if you're working in a place like the UK, where everyone does speak English, recognizing there are many individual communities that have different ways of speaking to them, of communicating with them, different ways of building trust. So a key tool that we use here is personas, right? Really taking a segment and dividing it into subsegments based on behaviors, based on needs, based on attitudes, based on motivations, based on preferences, and then trying to target your solution specifically to those personas. You may target a solution to many different personas and then aggregate up or kind of build up to a total solution that is more cross-cutting. Another example is really building on existing infrastructure. So one of the things that we've, a general design principle is it's very hard to change behavior, right? And it's much easier to build on existing behavioral patterns than create new behaviors altogether. Of course, innovative design often does allow us to create new behaviors, but it is easier to start with what's out there. During the Ebola crisis, we put a lot of time and effort into building emergency operation centers across Africa, which were essentially new models of connecting government government ministries so that they could better cooperate particularly in countries that had less developed healthcare systems. And so how can you, now that this infrastructure was built, how could you quickly leverage that or build on it further when you have a new type of crisis, right? And so some of those communication channels were still working. Some of them could be refreshed with new technologies and new systems. Some could be combined with other types of services that had come onto the market over the course of the last few years. So all of these were ways to essentially piggyback new ideas across elements of an existing infrastructure. Journey maps and ecosystem maps are a great way to help you think through that and see if there are opportunities to build on what exists today. In a similar vein, existing technology can be built on in a very similar way. Rather than trying to create completely new apps or messaging platforms or websites. Not to say you can't do that, but to what extent can you use existing platforms that are increasingly opening up? So we've been creating messenger services on WhatsApp in South Africa and India that allow the entire population to just communicate over WhatsApp, which everyone's already familiar with. We've been creating educational content. This is in Peru. That was more actually around the Zika crisis that builds on existing educational content that is used in schools. We've been creating new messaging and communication apps, building on the community, the emergency operation centers that I was describing in West Africa that just improve the flow of information between ministries of health and local districts, right? So all of these are situations where you can bring something to market much more quickly if you leverage existing technologies as opposed to trying to invent something from scratch. Another key issue is around secondary effects and follow-on effects. One of the interesting things that I think we're only starting to appreciate now is how something like COVID actually creates negative additional impact. For example, we're seeing increasing examples of gender-based violence in homes, right? When people are forced to stay at homes in abusive relationships. We're finding situations where farmers' ability to harvest and work on their farms, which are typically generally isolated from other farms, but their ability to do so is quite restricted. We're finding the time poverty issues, right, where the amount of time women have to spend at home in many countries taking care of their children creates a disproportionate balance in what the husband and the mother or the husband and wife are able to do in terms of supporting their families, which creates other types of internal tensions, right? All of these are places where there could be some interesting interventions that will be very relevant and very helpful. Mental health is obviously another issue that comes up quite a bit in those of us who are trying to work in this environment. And so personas and experience maps, which are not a tool I'm going to get into too much depth in today's presentation, but a way of essentially mapping the different levels of experience and feelings and attitudes that people develop over the course of a journey. All of these are helpful tools to help think through the impact of what these secondary effects are and what their interrelationship could be. Similarly, I think supporting decision-making and policy and funding is actually very valuable as well. We found that much as there's, often a feeling of urgency to do something now and bring something to life quickly, and that is definitely a need around the current pandemic, we also know this pandemic will be around for some time. It's not going to disappear in 3 months. We're likely going to be feeling the effects for years, not to mention, if the world goes into some form of recession. And so the decision makers, kind of policymakers and funders who operate at kind of at that broader ecosystem level, and often at a much slower pace, will be making a difference and are important parts of the solution. But they're often operating in a world that is data poor and has little intelligence. And so things that actually help that process of decision making can be quite impactful. So we've been running longitudinal studies with farmers across the world, trying to understand how they're being affected and how what's happening now versus what's happening in 3 months versus what's happening in 6 months, when you go from a period of general anxiety to actual real unemployment and social unrest and obviously lives lost. We've been creating data dashboards to look at flows of people or flows of incidents of COVID incidents within a city or within neighborhoods, using mobile data and other government data, to create these dashboards that allow governments to understand what's happening in their communities, where patterns are emerging that could all influence the policies that they put in place over the next 3 to 6 months, right? So those are, these may feel less tangible and less indirect, but given the impact that major government policies can have or major funders can have across the world, these are definitely areas to think about. And then finally, think about the innovation ecosystems. Like what you're all doing now is a great example of that. But there are many other examples of communities of people who can put their creativity to use in some way and who have not been putting their creativity to use, right? So how do you essentially replicate what you're doing right now in different contexts? We've been looking at the product supply chain quite a bit, right? How do you think about getting personal protective equipment into more places, and how can you create more innovation around that? Can you use more of a crowdsourcing model? Can you tap into the capacity of fab labs and inventors and tinkerers and makers and people who just want to do something with their spare time and creativity, and often their 3D printers or their excess manufacturing capacity at their plant, or other types of manufacturing and engineering resources? How do you tap into that capacity? How do you orient it towards creativity by creating the types of platforms that connect people? So we've been doing a lot of work in that space, and one of the great things we can do is just get more people to be thinking about the problem. So that's just a quick landscape of some of the work that we've been doing that's quite quite broad, right? Some of these are very focused, some of these are broader, some of these operate at the individual company level, some are at the level of governments or kind of global partnerships. And so hopefully these are, there's some design principles here that will be valuable to the issues that you're looking at. But wanted to switch the focus to some of the methods that I've spoken about right now. I'm not going to be able to go into all of these methods in depth, but I know some of you have previously the organizers have shared with you some of the toolkits that we've been using. There's a lot that's out there already. I mean, many of this is the practice of human-centered design, which is what we do, which is core to this, and many related design and innovation methodologies have been around for a while. There are many toolkits that are out there. And many of these methods look similar. There may be variations in the types of worksheets or the way that some of them are structured, but fundamentally, they do the same thing. And there's nothing that's rocket science about these, or there's nothing that's special about any particular organization's methods versus any other organization's methods. So feel free to use what you've already found. Feel free to explore some of the links that have been shared with you already. Or if you find other things that you want to try, definitely approach this in the spirit of experimentation. Core to this methodology, as I've said, is, it is human-centered design, which is what we use as the general kind of framing term for this, for the methodology, but it combines many types of approaches. And I think often it's associated with in-person user research, which is very much the core of what this is about. But it also involves rapid and iterative prototyping. So being able to come up with ideas quickly, iterate on them, test them, and then use them to improve, to come up with, progressively better solutions. There's a strong systems thinking element to this, particularly around a pandemic response, given the interconnected nature of all the parties involved. So being able to think about not just end users, but the broader set of stakeholders or distribution systems or technology systems that come together is important. There's often a strong messaging and behavioral change communications aspect to a lot of this. And in some cases, there's an organization and cultural change aspect to a lot of it as well. So HCD, at least in the way that we practice it, does bring together many other families of creative and analytical methodologies. But the challenge is, of course, doing this in a remote context. And so I think I'm just sharing here again kind of two links to two of our primers, which are snapshots of, or not snapshots, but they're slices of larger toolkits that we've put together. These are on our website. I think they've you also have the direct links, and these have more detail on a lot of the methods that we use. And these, within the primers, you'll see additional links to further, actual toolkit templates and other resources that you can find that could help you. So feel free to browse and experiment. But want to call out, I'm not going to go, don't have time to go through everything here, but want to call out a few key steps of the process and some of the key tools that I think will be hopefully applicable to many of you. So overall, of course, this is a relatively straightforward process of planning, research and design, and synthesis. The research and design part is the iterative part, right? You can go through multiple cycles in the time that you have. You may not be able to go through too many cycles, but these cycles can be very quick. They can be over the course of a single day. Planning is quite important in this in a remote research environment. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the steps here, but the ones that are relevant in a remote research context is the second stage here, assessing digital and language literacy. So many of the methods that we use need to be adapted, and you think about whether you're conducting an interview in a low connectivity environment, which means it's essentially a phone call, and it may be a short phone call as well. And in that case, it's generally anonymous. The person, of course, can't see you. But at the same time, as I'm sure you've all experienced, we all are capable of having some really deep and meaningful and insightful phone calls that are only voice with people we know or people we trust, right? And so in a research context, the goal is developing that level of trust and developing that level of rapport. It can be done. It takes skill, it takes practice, but it is definitely possible. Moving along the spectrum, you may have an environment where you could use something like WhatsApp, which allows you to share prompts or share images or kind of create a bit more of an interactive dialogue while you're speaking. And of course, in higher connectivity environments with people who are more technology literate, you could use video calls and also some tools that you'll see plenty of links to, such as Mural, which is a tool we like quite a bit. It allows you to create essentially, workspaces with templates for worksheets, and it allows you to co-create together, the equivalent of, moving Post-its around and, and annotating, a worksheet in real time together. And so that's something you can do in higher literacy context. The key challenge is knowing for the particular challenge and context you're looking at, what is the right place to start, and also ensuring that you have some fallback mechanisms. We often find you start one way and then halfway through you need to switch to a different method. Or in countries where we work, power dies, connectivity dies, batteries die, and you need to switch to another approach or try again later, right? So being flexible is definitely a key part of this. And then, of course, the other two parts to call out are the methods and design activities that you'd use, right? What are the specific questions that will and approaches that you would use that address your research goals? Two worksheets that you'll see that kind of help you do this. I mean, you could do this, in a just kind of automatically on your own, just by talking through some of the points. But if it's helpful, here's an example of a research planning worksheet where you really describe what is your focus, what is the context of where your research will take place, what are the themes you want to explore, what are the participants you want to learn from, and how will the, what are the approaches and methods and activities that you'll use to conduct research, right? So using a worksheet like this can provide a bit of structure to this idea of research planning. And then you can use this to inform what is the actual structure of the interview itself. How are you going to establish rapport, right, over the phone with someone you don't know, right? Is it going to be some opening questions, asking about their lifestyle? It's going to be sharing some of the challenges that you're going through to make it feel more personal. There are a lot of ways to establish rapport. What are the foundational questions you're going to ask, right, about just understanding more about the problem if you don't know much about it? What are the narrative questions that you're going to ask, right? Getting people to tell you stories is the most powerful thing in HCD research, right? Because stories are where you really are able to draw out insights. And it's much easier for people to tell stories about their own lives and ask questions that are abstract, right? What are your biggest pain points? What are your biggest needs? Like, what does that mean, right? Those are not really good questions. They're good. We know we need to ask those questions as researchers, but to people we're speaking to, that's just jargon, right? And so asking people to tell stories about their lives, asking people to imagine their future, speculative questions are really powerful ways. And it puts more burden on you as a researcher to extract insights, but that's essentially what this approach is about. And then, of course, participatory methods, which are how you engage people to co-create and think about solutions together. Moving on a bit into the research and design process, and this is, this brings together a bit of a research design and synthesis. There are foundational research methods, co-creation methods, and prototyping methods, and there's a ton that fits into these categories. And so I'll share a few examples. Of course, interviewing is at the core of this. And as I mentioned, there are different degrees of complexity that you could explore in different ways. You could complement the core technology that you're using for the communication, whether it's a phone call or a WhatsApp video call or Google Doc or a mural board with other types of methods, right? So asking people to show them their space, right? We turn on the video and show them their space, sending some prompts, low fidelity prototypes over the WhatsApp message, or asking them to role play, right? All of these are things that you can do over the course of an interview. Journey mapping, as I mentioned in some of the inspiration examples, is so core. I mean, this is one of the almost every situation we find that journey mapping is needed in some form. This could be a synthesis method, right, where you actually talk through steps of a journey over a call, but you actually document yourself based on learnings from multiple interviews. But in some cases, you can create journeys together with your participants, and this is actually quite powerful if the technology that you have, or the technology and connectivity environment allows you to do this. Journeys essentially are trying to think through steps and then think through different components of those steps. So these could be goals, activities, needs, barriers, emotions, other things. You'll find many examples of journey templates out there. Don't put something this complex in front of a participant. Something like this is more of a synthesis framework that you'd use with your team to think through steps of a journey, but it's you could talk through steps or show a simplified version of this and think through steps, think through activities, and think through pain points. That's often a simpler way that's more participant friendly. Very closely related to journeys, you often find that journeys will help you shape personas, right? And conversely, if you have a starting point around personas, they can help you inform journeys. So as I said before, personas are that needs-based, attitudinal or kind of motivational or behavioral-based way of thinking about segments, right? So it's not just the demographics, the name or age or location of a person, but it's their aspirations, it's the products and services they use, what motivates them, what drives them, what are their most deeply felt and unmet needs, how you've achieved success with them, right? And so personas are a useful way to start thinking about how you can target your solution more effectively. These are something that you can use during your research and design process, right? You can build personas iteratively, right? As even from a single participant, this gives you a sense of a certain type of person you're targeting, but then the next person you interview gives you a sense of a different persona or helps you build on that persona. So in practice, you can build personas in an incremental way, or complete a round of research, talk to 10 people, and then start describing personas at the end. Again, a lot of these tools are quite fluid in terms of where you place them in the process. Ecosystem mapping, as I mentioned, is another really powerful method that you can use. This is often useful during research. You can use, a simple set of concentric circles and ask people to place products, services, other stakeholders or actors into places, into places in the ecosystem representing how close they are to them, or how much they trust those, or use those product, service, or actors, right? So in higher fidelity context, you could use a Google Doc or Mural to do this. Otherwise, you could talk it through over WhatsApp and then try to document it later. But essentially, an ecosystem map starts looking like this. Multiple concentric circles that essentially denote degrees of importance, and then you can start using color coding and tagging and such to talk about information channels or barriers or support that's offered. Scenarios and storyboarding are a way similar to journeys, right? It's a way to think about steps of a process over time, but in this case, you're actually bringing solutions, right? Or breaking down solutions, components of a service into those steps. So it's when you're a bit further down the process. Low fidelity prototyping, I think, is also something that is very core. Almost anything can be expressed as a prototype, right? A prototype doesn't have to be a wireframe of a mobile app. It doesn't have to be a sketch of a physical product. It can be a visualization of a partnership. It can be a policy idea. It can be a business model idea. It can be a new pricing model. It can be, combinations of all of the above, as long as they're expressed in a visual way that's, and visual doesn't mean beautiful. Visual just means it's concrete, it's sketched, it's just simple. That can be brought into a variety of communications contexts, right? Even a simple WhatsApp message you could send a sketch, right? Or send a little mock-up. And that just tends to make it much easier for the participant to react to. But prototyping not only helps you improve the idea, but it also can help you elicit deeper insights, because sometimes the topics that we look at or we're investigating are not easy things to ask questions about, right? But if you can bring in a prompt, bring in something like a concrete idea, it allows people to react to it and then share more about how they would feel, right? Which in turn could open up more stories about that will give you deeper insight into what's emerging. And finally, kind of just a couple of final slides on the synthesis process. And again, as I said, this blends a bit with the research and design process. But I think some of the key approaches that you'll use here: affinity mapping, right? So this is when you've actually conducted a number of interviews or a number of co-creation sessions, looking for patterns across those, right? So this is often, the classic designers capturing things on Post-its, right? But you can do this virtually as well, on Mural boards, on Google Docs, but capturing ideas and then starting to look for patterns, grouping ideas. These could be themes, these could be insights, these could be opportunities, these could be quotes, but visually moving ideas around and looking for where more ideas are expressed tends to give you a sense of what's more important or areas where you should spend more of your creative energy. And these eventually lead to insight statements, right, and opportunity statements, which are well articulated framings of the problem. I know you've already gone through a couple of days of trying to identify the problem, but typically a design process helps you sharpen where you want to focus. And so being able to describe what the issue is, what the pain point is, what the opportunity is in a very concrete way can be quite powerful. And there's a set of resources here around how you can do that well. And then finally, all of this is coming together into some final concept, right? And I know you probably have a template of some sort of where you want to get to on Friday in terms of what is your solution, what's the value proposition, what's the problem it's solving, who's it helping, what's the impact, who's involved, what are the dependencies, et cetera. Using these concept prototypes or pitch sheets as during the design process can also be helpful, right? It helps you sharpen where you should focus, and it helps you fill in the gaps. So don't only think of it as something you do in the last hour before the pitches are due, but it's something that could help you along the process as well. So that's all I have to say for now. Hope that's been helpful. Let's see, stop the sharing. And I'm not sure how much time we have, but happy to take any questions that you may have for me on any of what I've presented.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for that presentation. It was really insightful and helpful, and actually very relevant to what we're going to do today as well for our workshop. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions from the audience if Ravi has time. Perfect. I'll ask the first one. So my question is, how can companies and countries be encouraged to focus on sustainable solutions in bouncing back from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean that is ultimately that is the I would say more broadly it is the main question that you face in social impact work all the time. I think there's a variety of answers to that question, but I think the one that's most relevant to this is you can't expect that every type of organization or company or stakeholder is going to switch to a mentality of sustainable only approaches to doing business, right? Much as we would love to see the world work and move in that way, in practice, we know that not all companies will, right? And so how do you think about solutions that actually recognize that there will be different types of organizations that are implementing ideas in different ways, right? And typically what that means is you need to think about the agendas of public sector and more philanthropic or social sector organizations who always will be approaching with a mission-driven approach, to companies that are interested but and actually willing to invest in more significant ways, to those who are interested but perhaps less willing to invest in significant ways, maybe just through kind of CSR type approaches, and those who will not, right, who essentially are going to be purely driven by profit maximizing, kind of value maximizing approaches, right? But how can you create relationships and networks between them, right? And so much of this gets into the world of creating effective public-private partnerships, right? Where you ensure that governments, public sector, social sectors, and private sector kind of work together around solutions. Other angles could be really trying to bring together private sector operators so that they are combined with social enterprises, or move to a model where some of what they do is more public, so that there is a bit more of a broader sense of accountability around what they're doing. But these are difficult to pull off, right? But I think in a post-pandemic world, I think one thing that's promising is that many organizations are talking about wanting to change in some way. But we know from past cycles that interest fades, right? Unfortunately, right? And so trying to use the positive momentum that exists now to essentially open up what previously or historically have been closed organizations can potentially allow for those types of solutions.
Mm-hmm. So another question that we had is, what advice do you have for participants who are still having a hard time to nail down their problem?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I would, this is definitely, it comes about quite a bit because sometimes these problems are so broad, right? You don't quite know where to start. And I would say that don't don't feel that you need to solve it all, right? Or you need to come up with as big of a solution as possible, or as address the biggest part of the problem. I would say, given the time that you have, you're going to be restricted by the people you can reach to actually conduct your research, and the people that and then based on that, the extent that you can co-create. So sometimes a helpful way in these kind of more compressed innovation challenge kind of hackathon environments is to think about who you are well connected to, right? In any given team, that may be different people. It may be that, well, I'm particularly well connected to certain people in another country because that's where I'm from, right? And that could bring in an interesting angle. I'm well connected to farmers in Tanzania, right? And so let me, well, meanwhile, someone else could say, I'm actually connected to a number of people who work in the food industry, right? Because people in your family are, people, your friends have worked in that industry, or someone else is connected to. To certain people who work in certain types of companies, organizations, or communities, right? So as a team, think about just your own networks, right? And who you feel, if you had to say who are 5 people that you could call relatively easily in the next 12 hours, right? Who would those be? And what industries do they represent? What backgrounds do they represent? And what are the types of COVID issues they are facing? As a team, just have that discussion and see if there are any overlaps. And even if they're not overlaps, just have some of those conversations. And you may find that there are some very common problems that emerge or some issues that emerge. And then amongst yourselves, just decide that let's focus on some of those. I think the biggest challenge, given that you're 3 days into a 5-day process, is spending too much time trying to frame the problem is at this point going to be difficult. Try to move as quickly as possible into research, and the research itself will be so inspiring. I mean, what's great about qualitative approaches like this is you don't need to speak to many people, right? Even speaking to 5-10 people in 2 days, split up amongst a 4 or 5 person team is going to give you a lot of insight. So start getting to that stage as quickly as possible, and then try to frame your problem.
Another question by Maria: is there a rough number of interviews to carry out when working on the ground with local communities? Is more the better, or do insights get harder to extract from the noise after reaching a critical mass?
Yeah, it's a good question. So typically in the context of when we're doing this type of work, like some of the projects that I shared, right? Obviously we have more time than a single week, but HCD research in general is qualitative. It is not about breadth. It's not trying to be statistically valid and say that everyone in a country feels this way. It is about going deep, so the sample sizes are smaller. It is very common in the course of, let's say, a 2-week research process to speak to about 30 people. And those are in-depth interviews that are lasting anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours, right? Some of these may be, half-day co-creation sessions. And in some cases, it's even less than that. And it's more about going deep and using methods and, of course, an experienced interview team to really come up with deeper insights than what is generally known. And in many of these contexts, very little is known, right? I mean, if you think about you're investigating mental health in the Central African Republic, I assure you, no one knows about that, right? And so your research will bring up, insights that are quite deep. However, to be fair, if this is trying to inform government policies or a business plan that a company is putting together or a product strategy, it often needs more rigor, right? And so we often complement this research and practice with larger scale quantitative research, right? That could involve nationwide surveys, that could involve, looking at, looking at large scale data sets to create segmentation models, things like that are often used in practices used in marketing and product strategy and policy, and bringing together the depth and richness of qualitative approaches with broader, broader market-based research approaches.
So given the short time of the hackathon, what is the top method you would suggest you use to improve your solution?
I mean, it's essentially it is in-depth interview. It is one-on-one interviews that are aiming for to get, I would say on average, they're between 30 minutes to 1 hour. I would say the first couple of interviews, depending on how much you know about this space, like if you for some reason have a lot of familiarity around this topic, or you've done, enough market research around the particular secondary research around the particular issue that you're looking at, you may you may not you may be able to spend less time in those initial interviews just understanding the lay of the land, but ideally those interviews start turning into a mix of foundational research and generative research, as we like to say, right? So not only are you trying to understand what the research participants' issues are, what their pain points are, but you're also able to start bringing in some ideas, right? And this becomes quite fluid, right? It's not half the interview is understanding, half the interview is talking about ideas, right? You start blending them together, and start bringing ideas or aspects of your solution in and testing them, right? So essentially, it's a mix of learning, co-creation, happening in the same context of a single 30 to 60-minute interview. That's going to be the most effective way. If you feel like you have the ability to connect people and are comfortable using the technology, you could try small group interviews, 2, 3, 4 people. It's a bit tougher to pull off, but that may also be doable. But I would say that's the main method to use given the time that you have.
So we have last 2 questions, Ravi. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what available measures do designers have to influence negative attitude or associations developed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly part of, I think the example that I was sharing, one of the first inspiration example that I shared, right? Like so much of what the pandemic is doing is actually changing our conception of what a typical product or service experience is, right? Because of these lasting impressions, right? That go beyond the actual engagement with the particular product or service. So part of what as designers we can do is firstly try to think more broadly, right, about what that journey actual is, what those layers of experience actually are, and then trying to think about solutions that extend to that level. Now, this is where I think in the context of what you're doing, that's a bit more challenging, right? Because if you really look at all the secondary effects and try to look at the full range of the journey, each of those could lend itself to its own type of solution, right? So it may be the core idea for improving product, improving the experience on trains, involves a set of things that you come up with. But changing the broader mindset is something that involves a totally different type of solution, right? It could involve what messaging that's happening at the workplace, right, from a corporation. It could involve things that are happening in school for students who take public transportation. Those are totally different ideas than from what the transport authority is going to do, right? Now, when you're thinking about a systemic solution, you should think about all of that, right? And that's part of what we have the luxury and privilege to do, given the time we have to work on some of these problems and the number of stakeholders we interact with. But in a shorter time frame, it's great if you can paint that bigger picture. That shows some deep insight if you're able to think about the broader ecosystem, or you can think about secondary effects, as I mentioned, like the gender-based violence example or the time poverty example. But you're not going to have the time to come up with a solution to every one of those levels, right? So if you can present the problem in a broader way, but come up with a focused solution for just a part of it, at least my take is that in the context of a hackathon, that would be fantastic, right? Because that shows you understand the depth of the breadth of the problem, but you're still focusing on something that's manageable.
So would you recommend journey mapping as the best start to designing for behavior change, or is there another framework you would suggest?
So I would say journey mapping and ecosystem mapping go hand in hand, right? Sometimes a journey mapping exercise is going to be more useful. In some cases, an ecosystem map exercise is most useful. Often we use both, and often, of course, those come together to inform personas. So sorry, I know that's not a single tool, but in some ways, like personas, journeys, ecosystems, and the personas that sit around them are the core way to think about a person and their behavior. So you could start with any one of those.
Okay, so we have one last question, just the last one. Although one-on-one interviews are very insightful and allow deep understanding of issues, are there occasions where you've found focus groups to be more beneficial?
I mean, in practice, when you have more time, focus groups, and just to be clear, what we often will use a term, just kind of small group discussions. Focus groups often have a connotation of asking a lot of questions at people, and can be quite extractive. A small group kind of co-creation session that does allow people to work together. I mean, it's focus group in style and that it's 6 to 8 people, but there's part of it is, but it uses a different set of research methods. Those are definitely beneficial. However, they are much harder to run in in a remote environment, right? It means you're connecting people and you need to ensure they all have generally strong connectivity, which again, depending on who you're targeting, could be the case. Often a focus group involves ensuring there's a level of trust amongst participants to ensure they can speak to one another. So do these participants know one another? It's harder to build that relationship virtually. In the real world, you can do things, activities for people to get to know one another, icebreakers, stuff like that to get people comfortable. I mean, unless your focus group is a group of people who know one another, like a family or neighbors or people who are already somewhat familiar with one another, it can be a bit harder. And then facilitation is tricky as well, right? Because a lot of the time in the real world, people are talking over one another, interrupting one another, building on one another, right? And that gets messy. A good facilitator knows how to control the conversation, shut people down, elevate other people, ensure all voices are represented in the right way, right? And it's harder to do virtually. Now, not impossible to do. I mean, we have people on our team who are very good at muting, unmuting, directing attention, switching focus on Zoom. It just requires some practice. So if you feel you have the right group of people, a trusted environment, and feel that you can experiment in that way, you can do it. It can definitely be very powerful, but it's a bit of a tougher method.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ravi. This was really helpful for all of our participants. So thanks a lot for your time.
Yep, absolutely. And definitely feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. I'm happy to answer them as best I can. Good luck with all of your work, and really looking forward to seeing what emerges.
Thank you
so much for coming. I think that was really useful for everybody here, as Anu said. Thank you so much. Should I make your slides available to?
Yes, I will just send them to you. I'll send them to you right now by email.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much. We will send you all of the links to the solutions if you're interested.
For sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Yep, you too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.